Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Donald Trump's victory in November's election came as a shock to many in America's political establishment. But across the Atlantic in Europe, his rise on an America First anti-immigrant, anti-globalization platform was less surprising. That's because right-wing nationalist parties have boomed in popularity on the continent since the financial crisis and the more recent migration crisis. While far-right parties have long had a foothold in European countries like France and Hungary, nationalists have rapidly gained ground in places like Sweden and the Netherlands, where such groups have historically had little sway. Even in Germany, where far-right nationalism has been taboo since the Second World War, the anti-EU, anti-immigrant Alternative for Deutschland party won a quarter of the vote in state elections earlier this year. On this edition of Global Journalist, a look at the rise of European nationalism and what it means for the global political and economic order that's held sway for the past 70 years. Now, in a few minutes, we're going to hear from three researchers who've been studying this phenomenon, but first we're going to bring in Silvia Pujoli in Rome. She's a senior European correspondent for NPR News who's covered the rise of these parties across the continent. Silvia, nice to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
You've been covering European politics for some time. I saw a quote from an interview you did some time ago where you talked about Europe in 1989, and you said at that time there was a view that nationalism had appeared to be a demon of the past, a relic of feudalism. So what's changed?
Well, I think primarily it's immigration and open borders. Certainly, it's been certainly if you look at a country like France, where the National Front has been certainly gaining has existed for at least 4 decades. It was born also out of the issue of it has the largest immigrant population in Europe. But it's certainly been with the opening up of borders, with Schengen, certainly with the big, huge migration flow last year from Turkey into Greece and then up into Northern Europe, that there's been an incredible reaction. Also, the economic crisis at the same time has compounded this fear of the other. And you have to understand, in terms of looking also at Eastern Europe in particular, they came into this new democracy very late. These are all nation states. They were born under the concept of a monoethnic society. Europeans are having in great part, most Europeans are having a great deal of difficulty dealing with people who are of different religion and of different ethnicities.
Now, in the past, a number of these parties have had ties to sort of neo-Nazis or white supremacists or skinheads. How have they managed to sort of shed that stigma, or do they just not care about that anymore?
Well, it depends on the country you're looking at. For instance, that's true more, I'd say, of what would be the post-communist part of the world, Eastern Europe. The National Front in France is under the leadership now of the daughter of the founder of Marine Le Pen, is certainly trying to shape itself in a more mainstream right-wing fashion, with fewer, for instance, the anti-Semitism of her father's generation. She's toned that down. The Northern League in Italy is a purely anti-immigrant party. It doesn't have any links to any specific neo-Nazi or neo-fascist group. And then there's this new Maverick Party, which has gained a lot of popularity. It's very high in the polls in Italy, the Five Star Movement, which presents itself as very modern, as a web-based party, and but they are also very anti-immigrant, and they're riding the populist anti-globalization wave that is taking over a lot of countries in Europe now.
And part of what's happening seems to reflect sort of a big loss of faith in the European Union. Why do you think the EU is sort of losing the battle for hearts and minds of voters?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the economic crisis, with the euro crisis, particularly in the 2010, 2012. Southern European countries had to be bailed out by the Northern European countries. At least that's the way it was perceived. These austerity measures have been very damaging to the economies of many of these countries. There's a sense that the sovereignty is being lost in these countries, and they are resentful of Brussels dictating the rules.
And Europe was totally devastated by 2 wars in the 20th century, brought about at least in part by nationalist political movements. And so do you get the sense that voters don't see this history as particularly instructive today?
I don't think they're thinking in terms of the wars of the past. As I don't think the labels of neo-Nazi and neo-fascist are so strong among the voters. It's much more anti-globalist and anti the sense that the European Union has taken away their sovereignty and against immigrants.
And in Austria, there was a recent presidential election. Norbert Hofer of sort of the far right Freedom Party, a very anti-immigrant party, he lost by about 6 points to the Green Party candidate. Is this sort of a big setback for the far right? Is this indicative that maybe this wave has crested?
Well, we don't know yet. That's too soon to say. We'll see what the big elections will bring in the Netherlands, France, and Germany in 2017, and also new elections, also probably in Italy. But certainly, it was a close call. But there was a lot of sense that perhaps Hofer, he would become the first hard right chief of state to be elected freely in Europe since World War II. It didn't happen, but it was a close call.
And we have seen that nationalist leaders from different countries have been lending each other some support. There's been some links between UKIP, sort of the far-right nationalist party in the UK, and the National Front in France. To what degree have these groups been able to cooperate across national borders?
Well, there's a lot of good feeling, as I've said, between the National Front in France and the Northern League in Italy. They also have very good, both parties have good relations with Russia, the Russia of Vladimir Putin. And also the Five Star Movement is, as I said, in the European Parliament is allied with the UKIP party. So there's definitely a lot of connections between these groups.
And just recently in Italy, there was this referendum on constitutional reforms that failed and led to the resignation of the Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. What role did sort of nationalist political movements there play in that vote?
The actual issues at stake in the referendum had nothing to do with Europe or with the European Union, but the movements, the anti-EU movements and the populist movements were very, very strong in ensuring the failure of this referendum. Again, the Five Star Movement is considered the big winner. And the worry among many of Italy's partners is that if there are elections this year, Five Star Movement could become the big winner and form the next government. And that certainly sends a lot of shivers down the spines of many European leaders in Brussels.
And obviously earlier this year, there was the Brexit vote. Donald Trump won in the U.S. on sort of a populist, anti-immigrant, anti-globalization platform. Where do you see the next big potential victory for these nationalist movements?
Well, first, everybody will be looking. I believe in March, the elections are in the Netherlands, where there's a strong Islamophobic anti-immigrant party, the leader Geert Wilders. Then comes France, and we'll see what happens with the National Front. And then we have German elections in September. And so it's everybody will be waiting to see what happens. We don't know yet what will happen in these elections, but certainly the populists, at least in the Netherlands and in France, are doing very well.
Sylvia Pujoli, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
A reminder that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today we're talking about the rise of nationalism in Europe. This has been marked by the growing popularity of anti-immigrant, anti-globalization parties from Greece to the United Kingdom. To broaden our discussion, we're going to bring in three other guests. Joining us from Berlin, Germany is Jan Techow. He's the director of the Richard C. Holbrooke Forum at the American Academy in Berlin. And in Berkeley, California is Lawrence Rosenthal. He's the chairman and lead researcher at the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies at the University of California. In Washington, D.C. is Alina Polyakova. She's a senior fellow for Europe at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to all of you, Jan Techow. I want to start with you. We heard Sylvia Pujoli talking about what she sees as the reasons for the rise of these nationalist movements. What's your take?
Well, I think we have three reasons that we should perhaps mention as priority reasons, if you will. The first one was already mentioned earlier by Sylvia when she was talking about the financial crisis and the impact that this has had. This has had such an impact, it can hardly be overestimated, both in terms of the personal impact it has had on people and in terms of the trust that it has eroded in the political system and into the economic system. People are really looking for other answers than the standard answers that they've seen and which they see as the ones that need to be blamed for the meltdown. And then there are two more underlying reasons. One is the middle class squeeze, I think, which we've been talking about a lot. We have, for the last 25 to 30 years, systematically eroded the income base of the middle classes. And the middle classes are the ones that are the boring part of the political spectrum, usually. You know, they're the classic center-left, center-right voters, not particularly ideological. If you make them disinvest from the political system by not, basically catering to their needs and by systematically putting them under pressure, you get what you have now, namely that the fringes are growing, not just on the right, also on the left, but more on the right. So, that's one of the underlying reasons. And finally, perhaps, something that I call sophisticated state failure, the fact that our political systems actually do work. We are not Somalia. Our institutions have not failed. And yet, at the same time, we do not get any of the major political reforms done, whether that's immigration reform or tax reform or pension reform, or, whatever political field you want to look at. For the last 25, 30 years, we've promised change, and big reforms, and we have delivered small things. And
well, let me turn this to Lawrence Rosenthal then, if I could. Lawrence, to what extent are these parties sort of a coherent pan-European movement? If your ideology is sort of France first or Hungary first, to what extent can you have a political alliance with, a party in Denmark or Italy? Isn't that a paradox?
It isn't. It is to some extent a paradox. It's always been a paradox of nationalist movements, that it's hard to form, as, for example, communism did, a communist international or a socialist international, since nationalist movements tend to see themselves as often as superior. But I think you're right that it's important to distinguish, and this isn't a perfect distinction, but there are movements, populist movements, relatively of the left and relatively of the right in that we're talking about. What you get in the Five-Star Movement, which is complicated, but it is not one of the classic right-wing movements that are characterized by things like, the Northern Leagues in Italy, or the Le Pen movement in France, or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. And also, I think it's important to understand, especially for Americans, that the right-wing parties, the right-wing populist parties, are not like the American conservatism, or even extreme conservatism, sort of Tea Party conservatism in the U.S., in that they have never been tied to free market and free trade economics in the way that American conservatism has been since at least the late 1970s.
And I think that's an important point to make. Alina Polyakova, one thing that does seem to unite many of these parties is that they are friendly towards Vladimir Putin's Russia. Of course, that seems odd because we tend to think of right-wing parties in Europe, the U.S. being historically anti-Russian, and left-wing parties being more pro-Russian. So what's going on here?
That's right. That's an interesting and relatively recent phenomenon that we've been observing, that even though the drivers of the rise of these far-right movements, specifically, as Jan was saying, are domestic, we've also seen this relationship develop between the Kremlin and many of the leaders of these far-right political parties and the parties themselves. Now, this is not true for every single far-right party, certainly. It's also true for some left parties, as you mentioned, still. But this has been an interesting, sort of strange bedfellow-like arrangement. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that leaders such as Marine Le Pen, maybe even Geert Wilders, and Strache, who is the head of the Austrian Freedom Party, are looking for an alternative to the Western liberal model, which has been not delivering on the promise of prosperity. And they're looking to other potential leaders who have a different view of what the liberal order or the Western order could look like or should look like. And that's, of course, Vladimir Putin, who's put forth this idea of illiberal states, managed democracy, authoritarianism, Russia for the Russians, etc., that really resonates with much of the agenda of the far right.
And Jan Tachau, in the U.S., of course, in recent days, there was news about the CIA, the intelligence community, concluding that Russia did actively try to interfere in the U.S. election to help Donald Trump win. Do you have a sense to what degree that has happened or is happening right now elsewhere in Europe?
Well, here in Germany, where I am, I mean, we're going into an election cycle, and we will have elections in September of next year. And one of the big fears is that we will have this phenomenon, pop up in our political market as well. We've gotten already a bit of a taste of it when obviously a parliamentary commission of inquiry was hacked, and the documents then showed up on WikiLeaks, and it was established by the German authorities that hack came from Russia. So here we have a clear first indication that the German market is a high priority market. We've already seen this also in the Russian investments into news channels, for example, here, German language news channels, and into their financial support for some of the parties. So Germany is clearly a market where this is happening and where we will, see this actually, start to get a lot more visible and a lot more impactful. France, I think, is a similar case. There are connections also between the Geert Wilders movement in the Netherlands and elsewhere. I can't really speak for those examples, but in the German case, it's quite obvious that Putin has a specific interest in weakening not only Angela Merkel as a candidate, but showing the weaknesses of liberal open democracy, using the idiosyncrasies and also the contradictions of open societies against them. And he's quite smart at instrumentalizing this. And he's got the agents here on the ground to do it.
And Lawrence Rosenthal, in the U.S., we've certainly seen what we think of as establishment Republicans kind of struggling to come to grips with President-elect Donald Trump. How about in Europe? How are the center-right parties there adjusting to the rise of the far right?
Well, the classic problem is, do you try to make alliances with them, and can you kind of ride the tiger? If you are a conservative party, can you ride the tiger of the far-right populist parties and not be kind of consumed by them? And the right-wing parties will face, as you say, similar questions to what the Republican establishment faced with Donald Trump, and continues to face, and we will see that going on continuously. The perhaps best example of that was the Brexit vote, in which the British Conservative Party under David Cameron found itself in alliance with UKIP, the far-right party, and under Nigel Farage, and found themselves, to their own surprise, sort of bringing in a policy, that is to say Brexit, that Cameron really didn't want, and that was the end of him as the prime minister. So all of these parties are going to face the question of, do you try to win some of the support of the far right by aligning to some extent with their policies? And if you do you run the risk of being eclipsed by the policies of the far right?
If you're just tuning in, we want to remind you that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're talking today about the rise of nationalism in Europe. We're joined from Germany by Jan Tachau of the American Academy in Berlin, from California by Lawrence Rosenthal of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, and from Washington by Alina Polyakova of the Atlantic Council. For more Global Journalist, you can visit our website, globaljournalist.org. There you'll find our ongoing coverage of underreported international news and human rights issues. You can also check out Global Journalist on Facebook or Twitter, or subscribe to the videocast of this program on YouTube. Alina Polyakova, I wanted to ask you about the countries of Eastern Europe, which have also seen sort of the rise of nationalist parties. Last month in Poland, there were something like 70,000 nationalist youth that marched in Warsaw with banners like death to the enemies of the fatherland. Now, you would think that people in these countries have benefited the most from liberal democracy, from being part of the European Union, from open borders. So why the level of disaffection there?
Well, before we get to the Eastern Europe question, I wanted to go back to some points raised earlier, particularly the point about Russian meddling in US elections and what parallels does that have to what's happening in Europe. I think we can't brush over this. In the US, we're now going through a period where people are shocked by the extent of Russian interference in our campaigns. People don't know how to respond in the political class, and I think also your average Americans don't really know what to make of this. But the bigger point here is that in Europe, this has been part and parcel of Russia's toolkit of influence. Russia has been funding some far-right parties, particularly Le Pen's National Front Party, and when it has not been doing so, it's certainly been supporting various outlets, not just of the far right, but also the far left. And I think this is just something we are coming to terms with in the United States, but it's something that's been happening absolutely across the board in Central Eastern Europe and now increasingly in Western Europe. And I would just point the listeners to a report I recently did called The Kremlin's Trojan Horses that actually looks at this question in Germany, the UK, and France. But to go back to your question about Central Eastern Europe, I would actually say that if we look at the grand scheme of things, West versus East and the rise of the far right, Western European countries are seeing far more popular far right parties than in Central Eastern Europe, which goes against, I think, our general thinking on this issue. I think Sylvia was the one that said that when the Cold War ended, there was this perception that Central Eastern European post-socialist countries were going to devolve into this hotbed of tribal nationalism. And of course, that hasn't happened. But what we are seeing is that these countries, unlike some Western European countries, have never had to deal with immigration inside their countries. Most of their issues have been without migration, emigration. And now that we're seeing mass refugees knocking at the borders in Hungary, in Poland and other places, there's not really the institutions in place to be able to integrate them, to assimilate them, and to really deal with this question. We've really seen Hungary specifically under Viktor Orban rebel against taking in the quota, the EU mandated quota to take in refugees. But I actually think that Central Eastern Europe is a place to watch. The Czech Republic is a place to watch. Slovakia is a place to watch. But overall, it's not unsalvageable in terms of support among the public for the EU.
Well, let me turn this back to Jan Tachau to ask you again about Germany and the rising popularity of this Alliance for Germany party. Now, we've talked about one of the reasons for the popularity of these nationalist groups has been economics. Germany has been very successful economically in recent years, much more so than many other countries in Europe, really many countries in the world. So what's fueling their rise there?
I think we have one trigger argument and one underlying reason. The trigger has been really the refugee crisis. The massive kind of influx of refugees in the summer of 2015 last year, when, for a brief moment it looked like the situation had gotten out of control and the government really didn't know what it was doing. This galvanized a part of the political spectrum, a part of the electorate that had never really had a home before, and all of a sudden they could rally around a cause, and they hijacked the AfD party, which up to that point was really much more of an anti-Euro party, a party of economic libertarians, really, if you will, Eurosceptic ones. Not so much people, that really had any kind of xenophobic agenda, but it was hijacked by that part of the political spectrum and then turned into a really right-wing party.
And now their policy platform, correct me if I'm wrong, it says Islam does not belong in Germany. The party leader has suggested that border guards might need to turn guns on anyone crossing a border illegally. It sounds like there's been a strong drift.
Yes, there's a strong drift. This platform has completely changed. It is now that, the kind of gathering pool for all of those people that feel disenfranchised, that have identity issues, that have always been unhappy with the mainstream parties, and they crystallize around the refugee issue. It's really a hodgepodge. Not everybody is on the hard right, but they're all right enough to kind of stick together and form, for the first time, a credible political party on the right, to the right of the classic German conservatives.
And Lawrence Rosenthal, how do you see liberal and moderate voters in Europe reacting to this nationalist wave? Do you see any similarities similarities to the reactions there to what's happened in the U.S. since the November election?
Definitely. There's been a kind of crisis of confidence in liberal democracy that we see both here and in Europe. The kind of when Alina was talking about the Russian influence and the illiberal state, which I believe is a phrase put into the international discourse by Viktor Orban in Hungary. In Europe, it's more explicit than here, but the argument is that Western democracy, liberal democracy, is kind of spent. It's a force which is tending toward decay and decadence, and the Putinists like to point to things like gay marriage as examples of the decline of the West. And I think in that respect, that's something that you find in among the followers of Donald Trump, and in particular among the followers of what's now called the alt-right in this country. The similarities of the alt-right and the extent to which they identify with these European parties is now quite explicit. And in contrast, to some extent, I think you'll find both in the US and in Europe a kind of crisis of confidence about liberal democracy, which I think is relatively clear in what's going on in the conversations, even in the Democratic Party.
And Alina Polyakova, if I could turn this to you, Donald Trump has questioned the usefulness of NATO and the U.S. security role in Europe, its alliances there. What would it mean for these parties, for this phenomenon, if we see greater sort of U.S. disengagement, U.S. pullback from Europe?
Well, what's been really interesting to observe is, on the one hand, these far-right parties, one thing that also unites them, which we haven't brought up, is a broad anti-Americanism. Of course, Le Pen is the forefront of this. But what we saw with the election of Donald Trump is that a lot of these far-right political leaders actually had very exuberant statements supporting the election of Donald Trump, so that they see him as sort of as one of them in some ways. And of course, some of the things that Trump has said about U.S. engagement, multilateral institutions that have guaranteed peace in Europe since the end of the Second World War, I think is troubling. And if we do end up in that kind of world where the U.S. becomes increasingly more disengaged from our traditional allies, increasingly more skeptical of international security order, I actually think this would lead to really negative outcomes.
Well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Sylvia Puglioli, Jan Techow, Lawrence Rosenthal, and Alina Polyakova for joining us. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.